Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of the Artsy Raven. Today's special guest is Suyi Davies Okungbowa, and he is an award-winning author of fantasy and science fiction. His latest books include War of the Wind, which is a sequel to Son of the Storm in the Nameless Republic epic fantasy trilogy, and the novella Lost Ark Dreaming. He lives in Ontario, where he is a professor of creative writing at the University of Ottawa. So welcome, Suyi.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about your background, like how you became a writer and professor of creative writing?
Sure. I don't know if you can hear me quite well. I'll start by saying, so I grew up in Nigeria. That was where I was born and raised. My parents are both professors, so obviously I grew up a lot around a lot of books. They're professors in the sciences, so it actually doesn't say anything in terms of literature, or you would think. But I did grow up with like novels and all kinds of books, religious texts, mythologies, books about science, and so just reading and the concept of it of always going into books to find new things, information, stories, etc. Was just like part and parcel of my upbringing, which I would say is not like necessarily typical of the average Nigerian upbringing, right? So it's very much like a middle class in the 1980s, 1990s experience. And so, of course, my penchant for storytelling was like sparked there. And again, also because of that background, speculative fiction was just like always there in the stories that I received, right? Both, oral stories and written literature. And so after I had attended university, which my first degree is actually in engineering. But after I had basically done all the things that the average Nigerian person would have done, and I started working in various fields from engineering where I started, but I also after moving from there, I started working in consulting, communications, nonprofits, education, stuff like that. I realized, okay, this writing is a thing that I'm capable of doing, and the opportunities. I started to learn about the opportunities that writing afforded out there. And so I decided to pursue some of them. So I started writing my stories, trying to get them submitted and published. I published a few, and I went for a couple of workshops and decided, okay, maybe I should try my hand at this thing for real. So I applied to MFAs because I heard about fully funded MFAs in the US, and it meant I could spend some time just honing my writing craft. So an MFA in creative writing felt like it made sense. And so I applied. I got into a couple. I ended up going to the University of Arizona. And so I quit my job pretty much and went.
Yeah, wow, what an adventure.
Yeah. So I quit my job and pretty much joined the program there. And while I was there, I was teaching and all of that. And when I graduated, I decided, to start, I decided I didn't really want to remain in the US, and I wanted to seek opportunities elsewhere. So I applied to teaching positions in multiple places, predominantly Canada. And I got this job at the University of Ottawa, I moved to Canada in about 2021. Prior to all of this, I published my first novel, David Mogul God Hunter, while I was still living in Lagos in Nigeria, because by then I had published a bunch of short stories. I had written this novel while I was working full time, and I ended up publishing it with Rebellion Publishing, which is a sort of like a medium publisher in Oxford in the UK. And I published that before I even moved to the US. And while I was in the US, I got a book deal for a trilogy for the Nameless Republic. And so I have basically always been writing since then. I published David Mogo in about 2019, I think, and that book was written mostly in 2018, 2017, the years before. And pretty much every other since then, I've been publishing a book pretty much every year. Um, so yeah, I have the books from the trilogy. I've also written for other properties, like I have a novel with Minecraft, a novel with Stranger Things, novel and stories with Marvel's Black Panther. Um, and yeah, so that pretty much is a bit of a summary of the journey that brought me here.
What drives? I'm just listening to you talking about moving between countries while publishing, and like half the people can't even like, do a proper move. Why
Right,
never mind publish a whole bunch of things? Like,
right.
is there something that drives you forward to tell your stories?
I think that I think I always wanted to be writing stories regardless of where I found myself. Um, because I'll start by saying like I grew up in Benin City in southern Nigeria, which is not like the place you think of when you think, oh, the greatest writers in the world come from this place or whatever. Not necessarily, and this is not necessarily anything to say about the city itself or the country. It's more like I just thought, well, regardless of where I'm coming from, I still want to write my stories anyway. And that never really changed regardless of where I went. I lived a bit of time, I spent a bit of time in the UK, spent a bit of time in the US, and now I live in Canada. And none of those things have changed by virtue of like my geographical location. And it all started from that beginning, right? Of like growing up in Benin City and thinking, I like stories and I want to tell them, and I was going to do it anyway. So, yeah.
Okay, so why don't we switch gears a little bit? Because you've been teaching creative writing for a while, and it's rare for me to find a professor to give us some advice.
Sure.
So, is there like a process that you undertake when you write or develop characters? Is there something you teach your students? Like, how do you even pass on this craft of writing to somebody?
It's not easy. It's not. I know people say you can't really teach writing, and they're not. That's not correct per se. Um, it's incorrect, but it's only because it's actually hard. It is hard to teach writing, and the reason for that is there's a myriad of things. First of all, you have to have interest and investment, which is often what you're struggling to do. I find teaching public classes actually easy because public classes self-select. People who are there already want to be writing, not
Mhm.
so much in the university. Some of them just want to get an easy A, or so they
Yeah.
think. um, so I find that half the work is actually getting them to be interested in the art of storytelling at all. But even after you've done that, then the next thing is you almost kind of have to ask people to roll back whatever habits they've learned. And a lot of people have learned a lot of habits and they've sort of welded those habits to their creative processes. And you have to sort of like work them back to like the principles of what they should be thinking about anyway. Um, Only after you've done those things before you start even trying to so okay, and now here are the things you should actually be thinking about. And I like to say, so currently I teach a lot of undergraduate, and I teach one mixed graduate undergraduate class. Uh, and what I found is in the beginning when you have like really new writers, the first thing is to treat writing as a sandbox exercise, as a sort of playground, and less so a series of strictures or rules. Um, or even so, the principles I think come somewhere along the way, in the sense that in the beginning, I think they should just play around and say, look, this is like putty, right? Just see if you can make something. And often in those classes, I don't grade like quality of the writing because it's not really good. I don't expect it to be good. Right? That's the equivalent of giving an artist some watercolor and be like paint anything and then saying this is not Van Gogh quality or
Yeah.
whatever. All right, so I'm just like, listen, just here are words. This is what words do. Try to make something out of it. Is really the ethos of those classes. And then for the next class, where I think of like intermediate, what I do is that's when I start honing in on like principles. I'm like, this is what makes a multi-dimensional character. This is what makes um, this is what this is how plot differs from just the events that happen. This is what concrete imagery looks like. This is what language can do in terms of mood, tone. This is stuff like that. That's when I start honing in on the very specifics of craft and saying it's not just describing. It is how does your description do double or triple duty in what impact does choice of POV have? What impact does choice of tense have? So I start working them through and saying when you make a decision, it impacts the story, so you have to make an informed decision. They still don't always get it correctly, but that's the progress. And then of course at the senior level, that's when I start asking about quality, and I start saying, okay, now you know all these things. Now here are some even more advanced concepts, right? So for instance, then stretching these concepts into long form fiction. You've been writing short fiction. How does that shift when you start thinking about long form fiction, like the novella or the novel? How do you make your writing better? What does revision look like when your vision of the story is changing once you start writing it? So the more advanced concept, how do you develop a writing practice where you write, say, 1,000 words a week? So one of my senior classes is that I asked them to write 1,000 words a week or something like that, or 2,000 words. I can't remember, but I think it's 1,000 words. But all this to say, yeah, I think it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of like planning on your part as an educator. It takes a lot of pedagogical investment in the sense of what are you actually trying to deliver here, and then I think the third thing is also it takes like the empathetic artist in you to recognize what is possible. What is possible, and to sort of like I try to meet the students where I'm at. I don't even finalize the syllabi before I get into class. I sort of do it to a level, and then I get into class and then I say, talk to me about what you feel like you're missing. Talk to me about what you want. And then I listen to them and I'm like, okay, this is actually, I get a sense of the kind of people who are sitting in front of me, and then I redesign the syllabus to fit them. So it's not like, I'm not trying to just give you something fixed. I'm trying to meet them, the people in front of me, where they're at. And I think, so that's what I do at least.
Yeah, that makes sense because some students might need help with characters, others might need
Exactly.
help with that. It just depends on the crowd, I guess.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Some need help with punctuation. So like you have to
what? You
figure
can't
out what
use ChatGPT. No, just kidding. The AI will take over any years. I was reading an article about AI will write everything, but I don't think that's necessarily true.
impossible. No, no.
Now, what's one piece of advice that you keep repeating to students? Is there anything that, everyone has an issue with?
Yes. Multiple things, in fact. The first one, you won't believe it, is tense. Tense is the bane of my existence. I'm not sure why it is or what the problem is or what it is, but I will say that I would say where I think all of these so tense and what I like to think of as well, okay, tense. I've said tense 3 times just to show you how big of a problem it is. I think every class I teach, 50% of my comments are, you used multiple tenses in this story, or this is the wrong tense, or something about tense is always a challenge. The other thing, though, and I don't know how to explain this, is I think people think of fiction as something that only matters when something big is happening, something grandiose, something world-ending, or I think many young or new emerging writers struggle to understand fiction as like there's always this idea that whatever story they're telling has to be like this big massive thing, and I think that has to do with the way the stories they have consumed
Hmm.
manifest. I found that you'd be very hard pressed to find somebody who's telling a story that is that has a focus that is specific, right? And sometimes not, small. Most people who are writing are just trying to tell this big world-ending
Well, they want high stakes, I guess,
yeah,
right?
like even the high stakes, right? And I even try to not to use that word high stakes because I
Okay.
think when you say that, immediately they think it's this other thing.
Yeah.
And I find often I'm almost telling 80% of my class that you have to find some other thing that is not that is important to the character. That's not, matter of survival or life and death or the end of the world. You have to find something that is high stakes for the character, not necessarily, a big, massive thing. And in fact, I remember having to say often and often, I want you to find um, the consequences. I want you to find consequences for this character's actions that are not death, and you will have no idea how
I'm
hard
gonna
it
die.
is.
Okay.
Like, not death,
Yeah.
or I'm like, why is there so much death and murder in your books, in your story? There's
It's true
way too
crime.
much death and murder. Like, what if? So I remember, like, the class I'm teaching this time, I was like, murder and death is banned. Those are banned in this class. You
Oh
need to
no.
find
Yeah.
something else
Yeah.
that this character cares or that matters, or some sort of stakes or some sort of consequence that is like beyond just those. And I think I preface this by saying, uh, murder is easy to reach for because it's, or death is
Yeah.
easy to reach for as a
Yes.
consequence, but also murder is very hard. It's very hard, and everyone just reaches. I'm like, have you murdered someone? Do you know how difficult that is?
I love true crime. I was thinking, I was like, oh, but they're so interesting. But yes,
Right? Do
yes,
you know how
yes, it's true.
difficult it is?
It's
Have you
true.
hidden a body? Bodies are really heavy. So I
Yes.
I make these jokes
Yes,
all the
they
time.
are. No, no, they are.
Yeah,
They are. Yeah, I
but
want to be a
that's kind of,
coroner, but
yeah,
yes. Yeah.
yeah. So those two are perennial problems
Yeah.
for me. And I find that I'm always, yeah, having to push back as students. I'm always in the realm of find something else, find something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Now, like, I mean, the students in your class, if they have a creative block, do they ever come to you? Are they willing to admit this?
No, actually, they come to me all the time,
Okay.
with their creative blocks. I found, and I say this because this is probably what other people have said to me. I found that probably one of my strengths is I'm very good at asking them a question, and that question sort of open up opportunities. In the sense of when they come to me and say, "Oh, I'm struggling with this thing," I don't immediately try to give them answers to the thing.
Mhm.
Instead, I say things like, explain to me what you're trying to do, or why that thing, why is that thing of interest to you?" And in the course of them talking about something, they find the kind of heart of what they're looking for, and then I say, that's your story there. Follow that thing, and I find that they usually find something of interest in there. I actually think that's the most interesting part of personally of being a creative writing professor, is having a student come in and then saying, these are the things that interest me. And then I say, talk to me about what interests you. And as they talk, sometimes I do this thing where I randomly pull a book off my shelf. I'll be like, this thing that interests you, what have you read about it? What media have you consumed about it, or stuff like that? And then they start telling me about the stuff they like, and I'll just pull a book off the shelf and be like, here, you should probably read this book. And so I give my students books a lot, and they're always shocked because they're like, oh wow, that's that's weird. But I'm like, yeah, and I do that because I think I think people need to just read more and have
Mhm.
more books, obviously, but also because I found that for a lot of this current generation, at least, a lot of how they have their first forays into the rhetorical situation of composing something is not what others before them have had. So a good example is the average young person first started writing something by texting someone, or
Mhm. Yep.
rather than say, like, I first wrote something by writing in school.
Oh yeah, I
You
had pen pals, right?
Yeah,
I was
exactly,
writing
or pen
letters.
pals,
Yeah,
or exactly, or practice letters, right? Um, but meanwhile, the young person probably has done something on Snapchat or Instagram. And the thing, what I found is the rhetorical situations that those things require are different from the rhetorical situation that, say, fiction writing requires. So what happens is they haven't really, what they've done often is the biggest forays into that world of fiction writing at best has been like a book they read in middle school or high school, right? Um, but then they've also not practiced the creation of that work, right? The recreation of the thing that they have consumed. And because stories, of course, cut across media, so they will always have, like, I don't know, watched a movie or TV show, or played a game, and then they would think because those are also separate rhetorical
Mhm.
situations, they're also separate kinds of media. They've not really specifically right, thought about literature and the creation of it and the requirements of that rhetorical situation, etc., etc., etc. So I find that you almost have to sort of re-engineer their thinking about what that means. And often the best place I can do it is, apart from the classroom, is when they come sit in front of me and I'm trying to tell them, I love video games like you do, you know, I love anime but that is not literature.
Hmm.
It's its own thing. You can take inspiration, you can love that, but you have to know literature. You have to think about literature if you want to write it, and you have to know how to do it. And I think it doesn't really hit home for them until someone says this to them. So yeah.
Although I wondered though, going forward, like if because they are growing up with different mediums, if
Yes.
literature will also change to adapt to whatever is happening. Like,
I think
things
it
get
already has.
transformed.
I think it already has, and I think
Like
it
the
already.
Victorian books are not like what we read today, right?
But
So it's,
even those books
yeah,
were representative of the
yes,
popular culture of the
that
time.
is
I
true.
don't think literature is removed, and this is why I don't even engage in the debates of like what high culture or low culture or whatever
Yes.
all of that stuff is, because I think whatever it is, it's representative of a culture of its time, um, and I think books are already doing that, right?
Yeah.
Books have always done that. Um, I guess for me, it's less about whether the book is like drawing from something or the story is representative of something, and more like that literature is a medium. Literature is its own medium, and I think too many times people sometimes forget that both those who are on the side of the creation of this literature and those who are
Mhm.
on the side of receiving it forget that that's what
Yeah.
like literature is its own thing. No one, for instance, or very few people, right, would want to create work in a specific medium and not pay attention to the
Mhm.
requirements and the craft and the specificities of that medium. I don't think that happens in any of the like in the fine arts in that sense, in performance, for instance, or in visual arts. Nobody tries to, you know, remanifest some other medium. No one reads a novel and it's like, and now I'm going to paint something, but I'm not going to think too much about actual painting. Instead, I'm just going to paint the Great Gatsby. you know, it's just a
Yeah.
strange. That would be a strange thing to say in the visual arts. So it's in the same way. I think it's the strange thing to say in literature to say, now I'm just going to write a book that's this other thing, but I'm not going to think about the craft of literature. That would be a strange. So I think that's kind of how I like to think about it. That you need to understand the craft in which you're working. It's like being a carpenter, right? You need to know wood, you need to know joints, you need to know how, before you start talking about building the most aesthetic tables, you need to know how tables stand on the ground. Without that, then you're just, I don't know, you're just playing around with wood, and you might have something, but I don't know if that is going to be a functional table,
Well,
right?
yes, and the world has so many writers. I mean, they're all snowflakes. And if you're serious about publishing, it's a
Exactly.
competitive field. Like you
Yeah.
have to see what other people are doing and
Yep.
see
I think,
because it's
yeah.
a business.
Yeah.
Uh, if
It's
you
a, it's
want
a
to
it's a
publish.
balance, right? Yeah. You have to sort of be both like artist and a savvy. You have to have a savvy understanding of the world in which the art is going to go into. Whether you decide that the work you're doing is going to whether you decide that that work is going to be representative of the world is going into in terms of like, is it, how seamlessly is it going to plug into that business world? It's a whole different thing. But I think even then you still can't do it without understanding how literature works, or like the fundamental concerns of what makes literature as a medium tick. And so yeah, that's and I think that often is something that is missing when I meet a lot of students. They just think about stories in this broad way and think that you can do it regardless of the medium. And I say you can actually represent, but that's why it's called an adaptation when you move from one medium to another. That's why it's called an adaptation, because they're not the same thing. You do have to understand the medium into which you're moving, even if it's inspired by something in another medium. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think out of all of them, like literature, like even if it's translated to a movie or TV, it's just the details are
Yep.
different in
Yep.
every medium. Okay, one last question. Now, is there one piece of advice someone gave you about your writing that you like really, really use and believe in?
That someone gave me, I don't know, maybe not. The one piece of advice that someone gave me that I have used is not even necessarily a craft advice.
Okay.
They told me, and so they told me, it's an author, an established author when I was just up and coming, told me, if you love short stories and you want to keep writing short stories, write a novel, and then you'll be asked to write short stories.
Okay.
Said write a novel, publish it, and then everyone wanted to write short stories. But if you write short stories now and you're submitting them to places, they just like not
Oh
publish.
yeah, they're hard to sell. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I was like, oh, okay. And then I wrote a novel, and he was right. Since then, I have never published a story that wasn't on commission or asked for. Almost never published a story by submitting anywhere since I published my first novel.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, that was useful. I mean, it sucks that that's the case, but that was a useful piece of advice.
All right, so you're going to do a reading for us. Could you give us a little bit of context about what you're reading and then you can start?
Sure, I can do that. So I'm reading from Lost Ark Dreaming, which is my latest book. It is sort of a science fiction. I mean, it's billed as science fiction, um, but I like to think of it more as science fantasy or existing somewhere in that spectrum. It is so the book is about the tower off the West African coast that is submerged in a post flood world where most of the West African coast has been flooded, and this tower is like the last thing standing as a society for people who are sort of surviving in this world. Um, and in this tower, the story so far is that something from undersea, right? Because some people are living below the surface, some people are living above. Something from undersea has broken into the tower, and people are dispatched to figure out what the problem is. But as one of these people who are dispatched, the main person has encountered something called queen conch, which is sort of it's like an archive of a sort of underwater dwelling society
Mm-hmm.
that has emerged in the wake of these floods. And they are meant to gain sort of like and witness the secrets of the queen conch by performing certain actions. And so this is a section that basically tells us what information they have, what histories or information or whatever they have encountered by paying witness to the queen conch, if this makes sense.
Okay, I guess when you start reading, we'll figure it
Yeah.
out.
So this is there are five of these sections specifically, and this is the second one, the second encounter. So the second encounter is called mutation, or upon placing the queen conch to nostril. It begins with the smell of evil, hearts filled with greed, the putrid odor of malice spilled over sea. Next come the cries of anguish, voices of strangers' skin, stuffed into the below decks, one stacked over the other as sacks. And so they are thrown overboard, cargo, free falling. Mama Yemoja has since put the queen conch to ear, and her ears bleed from the agony above. She puts the queen conch to nose and is stung by the sweat salt of those who placed the crying ones in chains. Her heart sinks to the ocean bottom, and she lets out a wail of shared pain. It goes forth a strong wave, reverberating across the ocean, forcing her discomfort on the waters, so that nothing made by human hands can witness that and live to tell. Therefore, she feels a duty to the criers in chains, when their bodies slap the water. Each she cradles in her arms, singing soft lullabies. But alas, their lungs are insufficient, giving out faster than they can exhale. So, into the depths she takes them, one by one, laying their heads to rest. But rest they do not, convulsing, fragile bodies rejecting the darkness of the deep. Mama Yemoja dips into her treasures, then, at last gasp, and brings forth the quickening. When the quickening, that smooth, holy globule of air and life and water and shine, touches them, their bodies respond to the tune of 1,000 years per second. Where the quickening finds usefulness, it retains. Where it finds deficiency, it provides. It erases and commingles and brings forth anew all at once, so that soon their chains are broken, and when they open their eyes, they can breathe and see and hear and feel and be free again. So are born the first children of Yemoja. We build cities from the memories we can piece together, slivers of our old lives oversea, no longer fully grasped. We build for those who are cast afresh from the bowels of ships, for there are many more as the centuries unfold. We build for children that never survive, for soon they are snatched by predators undersea. We build, but we are never safe. The bodies stop coming. We listen through the queen conch our foremother has left us. We peek over the surface, for as long as our new lungs will allow, to see what has become of oversea. Time passes. We grow old. We peek over the surface. Oversea has changed. The bodies stop coming. It is time to return. We preserve our history in the queen conch. We abandon our cities and leave the quickening behind. We know the stench of a human heart weighed by avarice. We know its stain never washes away. We know that, soon enough, strangers' kin will need it again. Our ancestors ventured out to the Atlantic and tumbled into the ocean, bodies slapping the water. When the Atlantic comes to Lagos, the water finds us at home and slaps us there. The queen conch seeks us out, or we find it, we're not sure which. Perhaps it was lonely and called us to itself, whispering the stories of our ancestors into our death wakes. It leads us to the quickening, and we are reawakened, rekindled, reforged. It goads us to place it to ear, to eye, to nostril, to tongue, to touch, and we do. Soon, we are inundated with yet another flood, this one of cries and mourning and chains and suffering, but also of rebirth, of knowledge, of lineage, of hope. We are situated. We rebuild the cities. We learn the secrets of undersea, but also those of oversea, for we possess a firmer grasp of who we are now. We thank our ancestors for the guidance given. We venerate them and ask for help when we need it the most. But most importantly, we remember. We remember the faces of those oversea, who turned deaf ears to our cries and offered us up to the waves. We bide our time. We wait for each moment, after they have become comfortable and dare to come down and venture upon our waters. And we savor it, the waiting, because we are filled by it, as we are filled, too, when we pounce. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Sure, absolutely. It was a pleasure.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarrard.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there is bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.